Hi, everybody. My name is Trevor Boucher. I'm a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Las Vegas, but with the NWA, I'm a social media committee representative as well as one of the webinar team leads. Joining us today is Jennifer Saari. She's a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Huntsville, and we have a topic I am very, very excited to be talking about for our June webinar. We're going to be talking about the first DEF-related operational meteorology journal article. This one is particularly exciting to me. I've spent a lot of time working with the deaf myself, and in particular with Jen, who is somebody who's been my partner in crime, if you will, on doing this in the field. And so we have kind of a pretty cool story to tell you about how we got started with that, and then how that segued into the theoretical realm. And so I wanted to first acknowledge that that we have both ASL interpreting here today, anticipating that we might have some interest from the population, and we actually have live captioning, which you can see on screen. If you'd like to partake in the captioning, we will share this link, and I can do that for you right up here. See the stream text link. I will share this in the chat for everyone, and what you can do is you can actually click on that, open that up in a browser yourself, and follow along and minimize it, put it wherever you would like. We're not going to have the captioning on screen throughout because we have some visuals to show you. So if you would like to use this live captioning, please click on that link that we shared in the chat, and then open it up in another browser and follow along. I will share that link throughout the course of this meeting as well, or this webinar as well. And so if you ever lose it, then I'll make sure to update that for you. So let's jump right into our discussion today. And I wanted to introduce Jen Saari. So Jen, you and I have been going with we've been working with the deaf and hard of hearing now in the National Weather Service for quite some time. I think we met in 2011, and you and I knew each other a little bit before we actually jumped into this, and so we were friends first and knew we were neighbors at Nashville. I was at Nashville at the time, and you were at Huntsville, and so, or you still are at Huntsville, and so we kind of met that way. And tell us a little bit about how you became aware of the deaf and hard of hearing population in Alabama, and then how you really got started with, working with them in the field.
Absolutely. It was 2012 when we had a weather radio outreach event, and a group of deaf and hard of hearing individuals came up asking me to program their weather radio. And they were asking me about captions on TV during, severe weather, and asking me safety questions. And I realized, like, this is an underserved population that we need to help. And so I answered all the questions that I could, and then I reached out to you saying, hey, do you know how I could get a hold of any deaf partners in the state? I had no idea where to start. I had no idea if anyone would even come to a spotter class specifically for the deaf. I didn't know, so it was kind of a gamble. And once I found a partner, Bell over at Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services, he said absolutely. And so then we had a partner. They were able to provide captioning and interpretive services and a venue. And I put together a modified spotter class presentation. And I remember you were there for the first one. And so we actually had about 24 people show up. Again, first time that we've done this in North Alabama. And it was a fantastic feeling that they needed this and they wanted it. And then, of course, in the middle of that presentation, I do the slogan of the Weather Service for lightning safety of when thunder roars, go indoors. And I was mortified after I said it, right? So I realized, oh no, this isn't going to work for you. So I asked that group, how can I better serve you with lightning safety? And they said, well, make your own. It's like, oh boy. So we worked together, Trevor and I. We worked with our partners. We worked with the deaf community to come up with See a Flash Dash Inside, and we worked with that community to develop the logo as well as a public service announcement later on, and it became official in June 2016. So really, from serving the public in a grassroots effort came out something that can serve many, many more. And that will always be a moment that I'll remember. And then we worked on finding other interests throughout the Weather Service of who else wants to help this community. And we kind of formed our deaf and hard of hearing outreach team to kind of spread again through grassroots efforts. And so now you have several people, if not more, throughout the Weather Service that do deaf and hard of hearing outreach, whether weather workshops or Skywarn classes. So it's a fantastic feeling. And yep, there you go. There's our logo and our slogan. And it's been amazing because even from there, once Sea of Flash Dash Inside started to boom in interest and usage, then WFL Birmingham worked on developing other weather safety videos. So I know Gerald down there is my partner in Birmingham, and so they did thunderstorms and tornadoes and flood safety. Then you had Wilmington, North Carolina work on rip currents. Then Albuquerque did fire weather and several other videos. So we even have a Weather Ready Nation website section where all this is held on. So it's really been amazing to watch over the past about 10 years almost, how much support that we've had, and of course support from our NWA attendees to listen to our talks and come and show interest in our posters as well throughout the years.
Right. So if anybody has gone to conferences in the last 10 years, probably, you've probably seen myself or Jen doing a presentation of some kind with regarding the deaf, whether it's history or it's their culture or it's a little bit about communication. And the Sea of Flash Dash is something you've probably seen before, and it's something that we had to learn in the process. That was something that we made a lot of mistakes, as Jen mentioned. I did the same thing where we didn't think of this, and this is something that we are trying to champion ourselves. So this was something that I think we both realized down the road that we needed to help, whether that's in the meteorological the weather community as it is in the National Weather Service. But then we realized there's not a lot of research being done on this and how the best way to approach it is being done, or what is the solution to all of these issues when it comes to communication access, when it comes to what the ADA laws are, when it comes to what exactly is the best way. You mentioned white versus red strobe lights. We'll talk a little bit about that. But this is something where I think that we both realized we need to get the entire weather community involved in this. This is part of not just Weather Ready Nation as it pertains to the weather service, but as it pertains to the entire weather enterprise. So how did you end up getting involved, with what was your pathway to pursuing that?
So to jump back just for a second, my partners have gotten grant money for weather radios and strobe light attachments and shaker attachments, which I had no idea. As a Weather Service employee, no one told me that there were attachments to help other individuals get their weather warnings. So once I was educated on that, and we started really hand these out and get feedback of, I like the white strobe light instead of the red, but we're like, the white one's really more expensive, and so with grant money you can't stretch it as far. And through the weather radio process, that's when I met Darren to kind of expand on that research for weather radio preferences and weather education. But with Kathy was Vortex Southeast, where I had started to learn about her research and what she's been doing. And then of course with Jason and his research with tornado warning communication with the deaf population. So I definitely found friends and throughout the way.
Well, that's a great segue into bringing on our next panelist. Do you want to introduce her?
Oh, absolutely. So our next panelist is going to be Kathy Sherman-Morris. And so she's with the University of, Mississippi State. I apologize. I know there's a difference. So she's with Mississippi State, and she's one of the other co-authors on this paper.
Thanks for the introduction. Did you want me to talk a little bit about the Vortex Southeast, or?
Yeah, that would be great. So how does Vortex Southeast sort of tie into vulnerable populations altogether? I was part of Vortex 2, and I just remember studying a lot about tornadoes. I don't remember this discussion coming up with vulnerable populations. So what was the tie in there?
Yeah, well, this Vortex Southeast has a social science component, and this is the project that we're talking about today is part of a larger Vortex Southeast project where we looked at improving tornado safety and tornado warning community for both blind populations and deaf and hard of hearing populations. So my part was actually with people who are blind, legally blind, which means they can have some sight or they can have none. So I did a similar project to the one with the deaf and hard of hearing population. So and presenting some of those results, I think, is how I met all of you. So
Yeah, I actually recall, Kathy, many times that you and I had crossed paths at NWA meetings about, how did we reach out? Who were the partners? How do you get involved in the community? Because that's not immediately apparent where you do that, especially when you're not part of that culture. You don't know where that culture resides or where they do their social activities or what institutions or what organizations might be around to help them live in a hearing world or live in a vision world. And that one thing I definitely learned was the spectrum. That deaf doesn't mean you can't hear anything, and it's not binary, that there's definitely a spectrum. And then hard of hearing is a different classification with different needs altogether, that maybe ASL may not be what their communication preference is, and that might be actually something with text or even just still utilizing hearing with something like a hearing aid. So have you experienced that, pursuing and engaging the blind and low vision community?
absolutely. And we, one thing that I can point out is that there's no, blind community. People who are blind tend to want to be treated as individuals, just like, you or I might want to be. But one thing, speaking about the spectrum, um, one of the comments that people who were blind in our study made was about closed captioning, which I know is sort of something that will come up with this population as well. And that's because a lot of people did have some vision, so they just needed different things with the closed captioning. They could still see it, but they needed it to be either bigger or to not block different parts of the screen or things like that. So yeah.
So Jen, Kathy, how did you guys cross paths, and how did you get engaged in the same project?
I think we probably met through Jason and Darren for the first time. Maybe at one of the Vortex Southeast meetings, or maybe at a conference.
Yeah, through the Vortex Southeast meeting, I think there was just a brief meeting, but really through Jason and Darren, where I got to know you better and really dive into your past works and how we can all really play a substantial role together in this research. So again, it's NWA meetings are just fantastic to really stop and meet different individuals and get to know them a little bit better to build partnerships.
And we have one coming up in August. You can still register for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm looking forward to being able to see both of you guys there, hopefully, if we are so fortunate. But you did mention Jason and Darren were a connection there, and so that's a great segue introducing them. So how about we bring them on? Kathy, you want to introduce them?
Yeah. So first, we have Darrin Griffin, and Darren is an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Alabama, and Jason Senkbeil is associate professor of geography at the University of Alabama.
Well, hi, Darren. Hi, Jason. Welcome to our webinar today.
Hey, happy to be on here.
Well, I was very pleased to meet both of you and learn a lot about what the work has been done. I loved your article. If you haven't seen it, go to the Journal of Operational Meteorology on the nwas.org webpage and read it yourself. Really fascinating stuff. You get to learn a little bit about deaf culture. You get to learn about the methodology for how they approached, being able to define certain levels of vulnerability, and then what the prototype proposition will be, what we'll hear about on this call. So I'm actually going to kind of jump off and give a little bit more camera real estate to our ASL interpreter. So if you guys want to take it from here, go ahead.
Sounds good. So would you guys like to start out just by talking a little bit about the study?
Sure. Darren and I started talking about this several years ago, and we realized we could combine our research interests and really serve the deaf population really well. And Darren can explain a little bit about his background, and we just as we started talking, we realized that we had a large population in Mississippi and Alabama, estimated to be about 100,000 people that are deaf or hard of hearing. And this is in the very active tornado zone where we get a lot of strong and violent tornadoes in Mississippi and Alabama. So we just recognized that this was crucial to try to talk about what we could do better for this population. So yeah, Darren, if you want to just explain a little bit of the background, and maybe we can share screen here in a second, and just start talking. We're going to show just a couple of slides and go over some of our findings and recommendations and some of the ideas we had going forward.
Awesome. While we're queuing that up, I'll just do a brief introduction. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Trevor, for hosting this and inviting me. And, when I met Jason at the University of Alabama through Faculty Senate and some community partnerships, we started talking about our work and this topic and the Vortex Southeast and the social sciences. And, as social scientists, we realized that this population would be a really good population to work with. And I think the most important thing about that is I identify as a member of the deaf community growing up in Austin, Texas with deaf parents. One of my degrees is in deaf studies. And so as we started talking about this, I was really eager to work with people like Kathy and Jason and Jennifer to learn a lot about, the weather enterprise and, meteorology, which I've learned so much. Sometimes I forget that, it's the curse of knowledge. I sit here today and some of the things I know, I look back from when this project started and I didn't know any of this stuff. And so not only has my personal safety increased in my personal knowledge, but also with the work that Jennifer and Trevor have done in the deaf community with the workshops and some of the partnerships that have been formed, I think a lot of awareness and knowledge has been spread in the deaf community through this product. And as we do research, sometimes, we do it and we publish it and maybe a few people read it, it gets cited a few times, but this is a very active applied project that has really involved not only members of the community, but deaf professionals from all over the state. We formed many partnerships, and I guess if there's a theme that I want to push throughout this presentation, it's the idea of partnerships. There's so many people in our states, Mississippi and Alabama, working towards these endeavors to increase communication, that no one group or one person has all the answers. So bringing people together to form these proactive partnerships has been key. And so hopefully our article is just a way to kind of capture some of that. And you'll see in our acknowledgement some of the people who have helped us, and there's many more, and hopefully we'll get to mention those or tell you about them in the future as we correspond with you. So I'll pass it back to you, Jason. I see the terminology slide. So speaking of deaf community and deaf culture, I grew up in a deaf home and grew up going to deaf clubs, deaf churches, anything you could think of deaf related. And like with any social group, there are views and ways in which people think and talk about themselves and communicate about themselves and perceive themselves within the world. And the deaf community is a minority community. So with some things, obviously there is a past and some history to it that people are unaware of. So we wanted to just kind of have this terminology slide to just take a moment to address maybe some of the terminology and vocabulary that's most appropriate and what to avoid. Oftentimes people think that the most appropriate term to use when talking about deaf people objectively would be the term hearing impaired. And in fact, that's probably one of the worst terms you could use from a deaf cultural standpoint. The idea of an impairment is not something that is is kind of accepted. So deaf and hard of hearing, if you talk about people who are deaf and hard of hearing, those would be the most inclusive ways to talk about people who range in the spectrum that we've talked about and their different uses of their senses. Generally and globally, we were focused on people who make up the deaf community and people who are culturally deaf. And the most simple way to think of that is it's a community of people who spend time together and they share American Sign Language as their mode of communication, and they share a historical past, and they view the world in similar ways. Obviously, I think most people know not to use the word deaf mute or use the word mute to describe people. And also one of the ones to avoid would be, talking about people as the deaf. Oftentimes I've been criticized for writing in that way or saying that. That's probably a common one to misuse, is the deaf. One reason I think that it gets perpetuated is some of the schools and the institutions are actually called Texas School for the Deaf or Alabama School for the Deaf and Blind. And so those places have had those titles for over 100 years, and they're probably not going to change them anytime soon. But as we change our language over time, I think getting away from, talking about groups of people as the deaf is probably best. I think the names of these institutions actually should be Alabama School by the Deaf or of the Deaf, because it's for deaf people by deaf people. And I think that's one of the big conclusions of our research is that deaf people need to be included entirely in this conversation and in the projects that try to increase some of their awareness of weather communication. So the last little note here is the idea of a disability. Some deaf people think of themselves as disabled and accept that label and some of the benefits that come with it and some of the assistance, but many deaf people reject the idea of disability as a lens to understand people who are deaf and instead think of themselves as a linguistic minority. So it's very complicated. Trevor and Jennifer can tell you they've been learning about this community for 10 years, and Jason's been probably learning about it for the last handful of years. You'll never get it all right. And so one of the big things is be willing to be wrong and be willing to be corrected. And that's probably the best way to be inclusive in this context. So I'll pass it to you, Jason.
Sure. I can't see if we have the next slide up. Sorry.
I can see a mouse moving around, so maybe Trevor can get it there for us.
You're on the terminology sign, Jason.
Yeah, I'm trying to advance to the next one. Sorry.
Try clicking on the slide.
Yeah. Okay, there it went. Several clicks. Okay, sorry about that. So I just wanted to summarize what we did and what we found. We had interviews all over the state of Alabama, primarily central and eastern Alabama, and we had 28 deaf, hard of hearing, or we had a few deaf blind people. And we had 4 primary research questions. So we just wanted to gather some information and start to understand how we could make improvements. And that's what we were doing in this first research, this first research question. And I'm not going to read all of this, of course, but the first question we were asking about information sources. We wanted to know the population. We use a lot of different resources when we have tornado warnings, and we wanted to see if deaf and hard of hearing people use the same resources. Is it slightly different? And what we largely found is that it is the same. There is some specially adapted technology, and we were talking about that earlier. Jennifer was talking about that a little bit earlier with bed shakers and strobe lights and specialized weather radio. TV is used a little bit less often than it is in the hearing population due to closed captioning problems and the frustration with closed captioning problems. But the bottom line is number 5, the decision-making delay. I just try to put myself in that position and imagine what it would be like if I was asking all these questions. I'm under duress and I'm trying to make decisions, and if I'm just not receiving the information as quickly as I could. And that's when it really hit me. So research question 2, what factors influence tornado risk perception for deaf and hard of hearing people? No major differences. Some evidence suggests that there's greater sensory perception. A lot of the interviewees talked about looking at sky conditions and understanding the difference between regular sky conditions or normal thunderstorms and tornadic thunderstorms. So there's possibly something there to greater sensory perception. Our recommendations here, and this goes into research question 3 also, but our recommendations here, there was a poor understanding about the convective outlooks from the Storm Prediction Center, and local WFOs are also using the same categories. In these risk categories, there was just a poor understanding. Most of our participants had never heard of a marginal, a slight, enhanced, moderate, or high risk. And so we think we need to better educate everyone about risk categories and tornado watches and tornado warnings. We had a couple people that didn't understand the difference between those, and it's like that for everyone. But the risk categories, if it's a high risk or a moderate risk day where you have the possibility of strong and violent tornadoes, and sometimes even with enhanced risk, we see that people need to have a better understanding of your enhanced, moderate, or high risk, and the fact that you might want to consider a different strategy, or you may want to really prepare a little bit more in advance when it's one of those high risk days. And that goes into research question 3. What are the protective action decisions made by deaf, hard of hearing people? Really no differences here. Like I was saying, every tornado is perceived as the same level of risk. Research question 4, the modifications. This is really important. For the modifications, sorry, I lost my screen for a second. One of the most common responses we had is that people are watching TV weather, deaf, hard of hearing people are watching TV weather, and they really wanted an ASL interpreter on screen. It's not the easiest thing to do, as we've been learning in some of our trials, but it definitely is possible. And we'll show you in just a second what our version of that would look like. But that was the #1 request that would really improve and cut down the time delays in receiving information, was to have an ASL interpreter on screen watching local TV weather. The National Weather Service should also continue to do what they're doing and build their partnerships and continue on and those endeavors, because those are working and we are making progress. So we wanted to just go to, there we go. We wanted to go to the product that we came up with, the best split screen format. And Darren, you can jump back in and talk about this at any time. But in our focus groups, we tried a bunch of different formats, and sometimes we had the interpreter in the corner. We had different layouts, and the interpreter would obscure some of the language on the map, or possibly obscure the radar image or some information. And our focus group participants did not like that at all. They recommended the side-by-side version, as large as possible, and the interpreter needs to be on the left-hand side of the screen. Information is processed from left to right. And so that was the recommendation. And on the right, you see an image there. This is a certified deaf interpreter and an ASL interpreter team working together in the studio. Darren, if you want to explain a little bit about how that process works.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. For those who are less familiar, a certified deaf interpreter is a person who is deaf themselves, who their first language is American Sign Language, and they're actually certified and trained to be an interpreter for the deaf community. What they do is they work with a hearing interpreter, and the hearing interpreter's job is to actually interpret spoken English or audible English into a sign language format that would be grammatically the same as English. That is not the most accessible way to translate or to interpret the language to people who use American Sign Language, because American Sign Language actually has a unique grammar that is different than English. And so what the certified deaf interpreter's job is to actually receive that signed English, if you want to call it that, and then take it and put it into the most accessible format of American Sign Language that would be broadly understood by a lot of people. It tends to be grammatically American Sign Language and also uses a lot of directionality. And so if you look at the image on the screen, we have multiple cameras and also multiple monitors that these interpreters are using. And what we did here is we did a simulation of what would happen if we wanted to live broadcast a certified deaf interpreter on the screen during a tornado event. This actually happened and occurred, like most research, a lot of is time relative. This actually happened before the COVID pandemic, before Zoom. We were actually still kind of doing things the old-fashioned way, even though it was only a year and a half ago. And so we brought them into the studio and we put them through about an hour in different stages of what it would look like to just do this live. And so the two interpreters are working together to communicate the message and break it down into American Sign Language. And then in the studio, they were actually, weaving it live into Richard Scott's broadcast that you can see here on the left image. And so what we did is we captured that, and then we created different layouts and samples. When I was a child growing up in Austin, Texas, which has a very large deaf community, and that city has taken great strides to be accessible to the deaf. One of my aunts was a certified deaf interpreter, and she worked for the city and would actually interpret the city council. And I remember growing up watching her on TV as an interpreter, and I would see her, and she was this little oval on the TV. I mean, just as small of an oval as you could have, and it was just this little cutout, and you were watching her, and you could actually see and interpret American Sign Language and make sense of it. But it's interesting to see that format and think someone just did that to do the least minimal, right? So they put this little oval on the screen and said, okay, we got an interpreter on the screen. Well, our job when Jason and I were doing this is thinking, well, this probably would not be portrayed on a public television screen broadcast to everybody, but given social media and access to the internet and all the different formats to communicate, we thought this would be a great way actually to communicate emergency and tornado messages to people in the deaf community using dedicated channels, using Facebook or different social media channels. And so in that way, the screen is set up to accommodate people who are deaf and hard of hearing to get access to the message. And through our focus group, we did the different formats, and we found out and reported in our paper that the deaf community, not only do they have a desire to have full access to information, it's also a civil right through the Americans with Disability Act that you have full and equal access to information. And so putting that little oval on a meteorology forecast, you're going to obscure some of the screen. And so by actually doing a split screen, you want to give full access to what is going on the radar and through the meteorologist's gestures, but also supplement that with an American Sign Language interpreter. So did I leave anything out there, Jason?
No, I think that covers it. And that kind of wraps up where we were on our project and where we are as we are finishing our project. And I guess we'll go back and bring everybody back up and entertain questions, and
okay.
I think that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, and as we do that, I'll just make one more comment that now that we are in a virtual, post-pandemic world, we're moving on our team and trying to test this, but also many people across the United States are working to do live interpreting. And obviously you can see in the webinar today, we have interpreters brought in virtually, just like all of our participants. So it's becoming increasingly more realistic to provide live ASL interpreting during weather forecasts. There are some different organizations across the state working on this, and we've been exploring that, Jennifer and Trevor and our team. And so what we're trying to do as researchers is examine best formats and costs, and obviously Jennifer mentioned grants, opportunities for grants to continue providing these services and also testing those.
What do you all say is sort of the ideal? What would you like to see be standard in tornado warning communication?
I would like all populations, all vulnerable populations, to have the access they need. So whether it's deaf, hard of hearing people, if it's blind people, and there's lots of other vulnerable populations, we all need to ask the questions, and we all need to talk to people, and we need to figure out how we can best serve everyone. As far as our recommendations go, getting a split screen format or something to a dedicated channel, it's going to come down, a lot of that's going to come down to the individual TV stations. And those conversations, maybe we hope that those will start to occur as one of the products coming out of our research, that maybe this could happen in the future.
I think my quick response to that question is incorporating people from communities and from groups, whatever type of social group that we're trying to reach and communicate clearly with, and bringing them to the table to work on our teams and to be a part of this ongoing thing. And I think even on our team, we've seen how much things change going into the pandemic and going virtual, that it's almost like we have to reboot. You know, if we started this project tomorrow, we would probably use a different methodology, and we'd probably find different things, and we'd learn a lot of new things. And so I think that's the goal, right? Is just be willing to start over when things change, and bring in people from all these populations, foreign language, minority groups, deaf communities.
If you don't mind me jumping in, I think Jen and I have talked about this a lot, actually, engaging the community from a weather service perspective. Now, we don't have much control over what is seen on screen in a broadcast world, but what we can do is advocate for. And so we do work with broadcast meteorologists. We are at the conferences, we are side by side with them. And so to advocate upwards is a great thing for us to be able to do. And it's sort of the responsibility, I think, of serving an underserved community. And that's sort of the definition of that, is to, even though you may not have direct control, you do have influence, and might be able to actually be the inspiration of change, or be the influence of change. And I know that Jen and I have had some direct conversations with colleagues in other parts of the enterprise, and things have changed as a result of those conversations. And so you guys both put it really well, is that you need to be able to be okay with being wrong about how you've done things up until this point, and need to know what it's like to listen. And to truly ask the questions first, and know how to ask the questions first before you even start trying to propose, solutions to these things, because you might run into walls, and you might actually lose the small amount of trust that you've built by trying to presume what the solutions might be.
In addition to what Jason and Darren have said, is to continue within the Weather Service on a national scale, get people involved with doing additional deaf outreach, weather workshops, whether it's in Mobile, where you may focus a little bit more on hurricanes, or out west where you're talking about wildfires. Just get into your community. And what I love about our group, the outreach team, is I've made a website where, where do I even start? How do I approach this community? What are, like, Darren was talking about some tips and tricks of words to avoid or things to do. And, like Trevor said, just how to listen in order to best serve them. Because I don't know the best stuff to maybe put on a slide. So I always am humble and say, so, if, here's like a safety preparedness kit list, what else would you put on it? Because by asking them questions, it teaches me as well. And so, because I do not know all the answers. And so just trying to involve that community and really listen. I know I've learned so very much, and I just would like to see the outreach continue. And one way that we do that is to celebrate the Deaf Awareness Week in September. And so we'll find the common hashtags that they're using that week and throw out weather information and safety preparedness information in there to kind of jump into that streamline, but get the safety information out to those that may need it. And for anyone that would like to share information that is related to see a flash dash inside, for example, is on the Weather Ready Nation page. So you can use it year round and grab it anytime you want. So if you're a local business, for example, you're free to grab it and use it.
And Kathy, I have some questions from the audience that we can propose to everybody, if you guys don't mind. The first one comes from Kelly Gray. She says, what do you all feel would be a good way to get information out to deaf and hard of hearing people in rural communities that may not have access to TV or internet?
I would try to find the regional deaf center We have several of them in Alabama. So we have, Darren, you probably know more about the organizational structure, but most states have regional outreach centers, and then there's a director. So I would try to find that person.
Yeah, and I think in the same way that we did our research, right, bringing people together to talk about this topic and safety, and then asking them, how do you receive your information? We had a limited sample, and we tried to extrapolate that this is what everyone does, but we know they don't. But I think some of the questions we asked were similar, and then they told us what they were doing, and we kind of had to reconceptualize the way that we were thinking and be thinking in the future. So I think asking them through the regional centers and the different services for the deaf in your community or state or county will give you an idea of how to do that in the future. But I'm going to use this as a moment to plug the weather radios. I know that there's probably mixed feelings about the weather radios. I think the term radio actually confuses people because we think of radio as having a speaker and listening to it. The sign for radio is like this. This is one of the signs. There's different signs for radio, but I think radio comes from radio waves, right? It's receiving information through radio waves, and I'm looking at my Midland weather radio that's sitting right here that has a screen that actually says what warning is happening. I bought one for my mother. We gave them out to the deaf community, and there's different attachments that create accessibility. There are some shortcomings. I don't think any communication tool is going to fix all of our communication. We have to be realistic, but it is an additional tool that some people maybe in rural areas can get information to then know that they should turn on a TV or open their phone or go to a neighbor's house and get more information. So I don't think there's one answer to this question, but I think asking questions is probably a big step. And there are, as Jason alluded to, there are resources, and finding out who those people are will be a big step.
And if I may, that's a great point about the sign for radio. That we can't just assume that the word radio is treated the same with the hearing and the deaf community either. It's a concept, right? A radio is a listening device. So when we come at a population saying that the best way to receive information is via radio, that if it were me, I'd be looking at this like, well, I'm not going to listen to the rest of this because clearly you didn't hear what I was asking for. And so it might be one thing where a strategy for us when we are pitching the use of weather radios as a notification device is not so much that there's a broadcast that you'd be utilizing, but it's a way to get warning information to wake you up in the middle of the night and receive information. So maybe it would be something that when we're talking about weather radios, it's not so much that weather radio is what you're actually using, but that's the device that provides you a alert system for severe thunderstorm warnings, for tornado warnings and things of that sort, because it is a lack of notification systems that don't require you to use your hearing in order to utilize them. That's the problem, not that there's a broadcast on a radio that you need to use in order to utilize it.
Not to downplay radios, weather radios, I think everybody should have one. A very small amount of the population does actually have one though, but a lot of people have smartphones. And so I just wanted to mention about meeting people where they are already. In both populations, we found that people tended to depend on phone alerts. So it's just like, different tools in your toolkit. You should have a weather radio. And we should also be thinking about ways to connect to people with their smartphones, I think.
An interesting point too about smartphone usage with the advent of wireless emergency alerts, WEA alerts, that did enable vibration notification on a personal device, which seems small to us as hearing folks, but it is a gigantic utilization in the community from an accessibility standpoint. And so being able to say customize strobes or anything like that, the notification preference there is something that is a step definitely in the right direction when it comes to notifications. I got a couple more questions. Let's move on to the next one from Beth Overland. Will Alabama National Weather Service use CDI and deaf interpreters to convey information in ASL when it comes to any kind of emergency situation?
Hi, Beth. Thanks for attending. Good to hear your name. Just wanted to say I can't speak for the National Weather Service. I think from the things that I've learned on this project is it's going to be essential for both private and public organizations and research organizations to work on finding a common platform to enhance communication for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and finding ways to not only improve captioning, which is lacking and not the solution, but to provide live ASL interpreting. And I've tried to start that conversation. I think it's a difficult conversation because of the financial strain that it'll have, but I think I remain optimistic that it can happen. I don't know if the central body or the central party would be the National Weather Service, and I'll let someone else chime in if they have other information.
I will add in, Darren, that some of the offices are working on doing Facebook Lives. And so I try to be very adamant in reminding, people in Alabama and, everywhere of making sure that the captions, yes, they're auto-generated and not perfect, but that's all we can do. So make sure that is on, or do a post below that, giving, a quick summary or some bullet points to make it as accessible as possible. But sometimes those Facebook Lives are done on a whim and not planned in advance. And so you would not be able to get an interpreter or a CDI at a drop of a hat. And then it's also the financial aspect as well. Now, I will add in, though, for weather workshops or Skywarn classes that are targeted for the deaf and hard of hearing across the state, I've worked with the different offices, and when we do that, we do work with our partners to get an interpreter and a captioner to make it fully accessible. Not every class will be, unless it's specifically targeted, so we work in advance to have our partners get that accessibility set up for us. That's about what we're doing, and hopefully that answered the question. But I agree, it's not the Weather Service, it's maybe more the media, and like Trevor said, it's working up to talk about that discussion.
Yeah, it's another thing. It's a conversation that from an institution standpoint, not just any one federal agency, not any one state agency, but we are all, as a weather enterprise, asking this question of how do you integrate accessibility, communication access to all of the places that it needs to be. And so I think the definition of being underserved, which I think we can all agree that's the case when it comes to the enterprise approach, has been we haven't come up with a solution for this, and that we need to, and that the pursuit to do that is partially why this JOM article is so important, is that it's the first of its kind. It shows that there's now a proposition that this can happen at a mass communication standpoint, and we can ask that question from tactical application at local WFOs, and in really any of those situations. So I'm encouraged to think that in the next 10 years, we're going to be coming up with those solutions, integrating the new technologies to get us to that point where we can, and then we're seeing that with live streaming too, that the live streaming services are providing things like live captioning. Maybe soon that will also have some sort of interpreting services that can be easily accessible, and things of that sort. So very hopeful for that. And I want to move to a question that came from Twitter, actually. And this one says, should there be some standardized graphics for severe weather events to assist in relaying information to the deaf and hard of hearing population? I think that's kind of open-ended to the entire weather enterprise, the concept of standardized graphics for a population.
My first answer is yes. The challenge would be to develop those and then maintain consistency, because graphic consistency has been the big emphasis across the weather enterprise, so that we don't create unnecessary confusion. We're all trying to use the same terminology for the same threats, and everybody's shifting towards that. So I'm in favor of developing anything specialized, and I've spent much of my career doing that. So anything like that just needs to be consistent and has to have approval from several different agencies across the weather enterprise.
This is a little bit tangential, but you know, I'm not in the weather enterprise and communicating and developing those things, but I know that there's industry standards and kind of culture around that. And I just wanted to tell a quick story. As we did this project, I learned that in Alabama, there was at least 8 signs for tornado in American Sign Language. And in any given room, if I said, what are all the different signs you can think of for tornado, half the room would raise their hand and use a different sign. And growing up in Texas, I remember there being 1 or 2, because we had tornadoes, but not as common as Alabama. And so I think, like with anything, right, that you have these kind of norms, but the more relevant it becomes, sometimes the more noisy it becomes, right? The more you have, and everyone's working on it. And so I think not only with the graphics situation, but with providing accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing community, as I continue moving forward, I keep learning that other people are working on the same problem, and that's a good thing. But we have our silos, and you know, Trevor just 2 weeks ago was telling me about some people that I didn't learn about during our project. So it's like this ongoing learning experience, and this, I keep wanting, like, let's get everyone in the same room, and I think we can all do that as attendees, partners, researchers, meteorologist, is try to get everyone together. Jennifer, it sounds like you've been doing that at conferences for a long time. Where's the conference in August?
It's in Tulsa.
Awesome.
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I love that point too you made, Darren, about let's get everybody in the same room and ask these questions. Jen and I joke a lot about one of the things that we get a question about is, what are you doing for X? So we might say that, here, see a flash dash, look what we've accomplished. It's a small scale. It's one message of the many that we have. And we came up with a solution that that might be usable for some part of the population, but really small potatoes in what we're trying to actually do, right? And then naturally more questions come up, not unlike some of the questions we've received, which is like, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And I understand that question. And I think to your point is we should all be asking those questions about what are we all doing as an enterprise or as our respective backgrounds are, and we should be sitting in a room and asking those questions and trying to tackle them. And one thing that I think I've noticed is that there's so many hats that, especially in the weather service, that you're trying to tackle so many things at once at the local WFO, at the regional, at the headquarters level. And so how do you actually tackle this from like an infrastructure standpoint? Like that's its own issue, like creating a full time looking at this problem. And so this is part of the learning how to adapt how we do things as an enterprise is dedicating resources to that. And that's one thing I think that's been very eye-opening as Jen and I have been doing, you know, grassroots efforts at the local level, and we've had some influence to get that up and supported. Otherwise, there's so much more work to do. And imagine if that was, you know, a team of people doing this 9 to 5, 365, then there's so much more that we could be doing, you know. There was one last question back from Beth, back to Beth. Do you have deaf individuals or interpreters a part of your research from the University of Alabama? I think respective to your article.
So I think as we developed the team, we worked with partners across the state to inform us and help us generate the research. One of the issues that I've constantly worked on in my 7 years at the University of Alabama is making the university more inclusive and accessible. And not to get too political, the University of Alabama is not inclusive and accessible to people from the deaf and hard of hearing community. I think it has improved greatly, you know, and thanks to people like Beth, who's in attendance asking the questions, and Kent Schaefer, and many of the people from the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind. But we're very far from being a university that is fully inclusive to the members of our state and citizens of the United States who are deaf and hard of hearing. And I think as we make progress on that, it'll be easier to integrate people into our research projects. Should we start another project on this topic? I think through doing this one, the work that Kathy and Jason and Jennifer and Trevor have all done, I think we've made plenty of partnerships and can work on future grants and research publications with people from all the different agencies who are interested in being on our research teams. So we look forward to those future partnerships.
Well, Kathy, we're at 5 minutes to the top of the hour. Did you have anything else you wanted to cover?
Well, you know, we talked about this particular population, but I think it would be good to maybe just mention that there are a lot of commonalities between people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are blind, and people who have full use of sight and hearing. So there are a lot of things that, you know, we can learn that can be applied, you know, across the board. Like, for example, sources of information tend to be very similar. Responses to tornado warnings tend to be very similar. Some of the issues that affect one group are the same issues and barriers that affect another group. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Just as an anecdotal thing, when we produce things like a graphic, for instance, and we use alt text on those graphics, we have to think to do that, and that's something that you have to manually input into your social media post. And there's a lot of times where we've created graphics specifically for a subpopulation, say for instance the deaf, with see a flash dash inside. And so many times it's like, okay, well, is that color scheme going to end up being usable for colorblind community or a specific type? Is this method of messaging in this way, is that going to be effective for the blind and low vision? The answer is no, it won't be. It was created for a specific subpopulation. And so it would be great if it did, but sometimes that's not the same thing. The needs in one might be completely different for another. And so the question becomes, well, are we supposed to create a graphic or a solution for each and every population? Yeah, that is what we're supposed to be doing. Do we have the capability and the time and the resources to do that? That's a different story. But the pursuit of having this communication for these populations is what we're supposed to be doing. So it is an interesting discussion too about those commonalities, but also those meaningful differences, and that there isn't going to be a solution that fits all. That's probably the number one thing to take away. And when you're serving the mass population, you're thinking about what does the most good, and unfortunately that then ostracizes those it doesn't do good for. And so it's a fundamental distinction that you're going to have to make these different solutions, and that it's going to be kind of tough to figure out how to make them the best quality for everybody.
Very good point.
So I know that we're at an hour now, so I think we could probably wrap this up now and start closing. I definitely wanted to make a point to thank Darren and Jason for being here and submitting your article, Kathy too, and Jen, because you're all co-authors on that. And also to thank you, our two ASL interpreters, as well as Jamie Parsons, who is doing our captioning for us today. And thank you for providing those services for us here, Darren and Jason, as part of doing this webinar. So it was very gracious for you to provide that communication access for everybody. And we will be posting this on our YouTube page as well. And there's captioning that's going to be provided there, and making sure that everyone can view this in the way that would be most beneficial to them. So again, thank you, Kathy, thank you, Darren, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Jennifer, for being on our call today. And I think we can wrap it up now. So I will say sayonara from the NWA's perspective, and stay tuned, as we're going to have another webinar next month in July. Hopefully this one will actually be leading up to the annual meeting in Tulsa in August, and we'll be sharing some information about how to do a good presentation for the hybrid presentation, or the hybrid conference that we're going to be hosting in August. So thank you everyone for being here today, and once again, one more time, thank you to all of our presenters for being here. You guys have a good rest of your day, and see you then.
Thank you.
Thanks.